Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're going to get started in just a second. I think we still have a few more attendees trickling in. Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to go over a few housekeeping things first, and then dive into what we're going to talk about today for our Black History Month projects surrounding materials that we transcribed related to African American authors from the National Museum of African American History and Culture. So I'm going to go ahead and welcome our co-host, our panelist for today, Tulani Salahu-Din, if she wants to go ahead and turn on her camera. And then I will get into some of the background and introductions. So every month, we are going to be talking with a Smithsonian expert to get more information about the projects that we've been transcribing together. I'm Caitlin Haynes, the program coordinator of the Smithsonian Transcription Center, which is the Smithsonian's largest community transcription and crowdsourcing platform. So before we get started, I do want to remind everybody that this webinar is being recorded and we are live streaming it on the Transcription Center's YouTube channel. The full recording of this webinar will also be available on YouTube after the event, including full captions. If you're joining us in our Zoom webinar today, you can use the Q&A feature to add your questions at any time. And if you need live captioning, click the live transcript button at the bottom of your Zoom menu bar, and then click show subtitles. If you have any questions about that or any trouble, feel free to reach out to us in the chat or the Q&A section, and we can help you out with that. If you're watching live on YouTube, feel free to leave your questions in the comment there as well. You can also tweet us, of course, at any time during the event at transcribed.si or email us directly at transcribe@si.edu. Here with us today as well is our Transcription Center Community Coordinator, Emily Kane, who is following along behind the scenes, monitoring the Q&A and the chat, and dropping in relevant links to specific projects and other information that we mention. So today we'll be discussing African American literature and writing in Smithsonian collections as a look back at what we accomplished together during Black History Month. Whether you've transcribed these materials alongside us in February or are new to this process, this is a great opportunity to ask questions about African American history projects in the Transcription Center, as well as best practices for transcribing and reviewing. During the month of February, we completed over 16,000 pages of personal letters, screenplays, poetry, and memoirs by Black Americans from the collections at the National Museum of African American History and Culture and the Anacostia Community Museum. That's more than we've ever transcribed for Black History Month before, so it was really an incredible achievement. So thank you to everyone out there who played a role in transcribing these collections and sharing and celebrating the history, this history with us. Every word transcribed on our platform helps to make the Smithsonian's historical collections more accessible, readable, and keyword searchable across our own databases here at the Smithsonian and other major search engines. So you are quite literally helping us to unlock history and share the treasures of the Smithsonian with the world. If you'd like to learn more about joining our digital volunteer community after today and how you can contribute to Transcription Center projects, reach out to us in the Q&A or the chat, send us a DM on social media, or email us directly. Keep in mind there's no minimum participation requirement for volunteer activity in TC, and you can transcribe, explore, or review materials at any time of day, as often or as little as you'd like. Do keep in mind, though, that you must be 14 years or older to sign up for a Transcription Center account. Now let's get into today's webinar topic, which I know is really why all of you joined today. So here with me today is Tulani Salahu-Din, the Museum Specialist of Language and Literature at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Tulani has helped to develop the museum's literature collection, acquiring objects associated with writers such as Lucille Clifton, Laurence Dunbar, Sarah Elizabeth Wright, and James Baldwin. Her museum blog series, titled The Power of Poetry, provides a historical overview of African American poetry from the 19th century to the present. And her essay on the literary achievements of writer and activist Pauli Murray is an integral part of the museum's digital exhibition, Proud Shoes, a classic in African American genealogy. Chez Baldwin is her recent digital exhibition on the life and works of James Baldwin. So we'll share a link to all of that information, Tulani's amazing blog series on the power of poetry and some of the other work that she's done in our chat today. So hi, Tulani. Thank you for joining us and sharing your time and knowledge with us today. So,
hello, everyone.
Yeah, hi.
It's a pleasure to be here today. Thank you for having me.
Yes, thank you so much. I know that you and I and our team members in the Transcription Center have gotten to learn from you about these collections as we featured them in the Transcription Center. But we'd love to hear even more and share more of this with our public. So maybe to get us started today, you can talk a little bit about one of the biggest sort of sets of materials that we transcribed recently from the James Baldwin archive from the museum. Can you tell us a little bit about that collection and how and why it came into the museum and what we can learn from those collections?
Yes, this is a pretty extensive collection of archival materials. It was acquired by the museum from the James Baldwin family. It includes items that we currently have on display in our inaugural exhibition in the Making a Way Out of No Way gallery. And it includes other materials that are not on display, but are available for research purposes. And so some of the things you will see in the Making a Way Out of No Way gallery is James Baldwin's 1965 passport, which documents the travel that he did quite a bit. He referred to himself as a transatlantic commuter, because as we know, Baldwin was born in Harlem, but at the age of 24, he left the United States and went to live in Paris, France. And he also spent an entire decade in Istanbul, Turkey. So he was really a world traveler, but he did come back and forth to the United States to visit family, to participate in civil rights activism, and also to meet with his publishers. So we have that passport. See, that one little item tells that whole story, with everything I just said there. So we also have a 1964 letter from civil rights leader Julian Bond, who was inviting Baldwin to come and participate in a hearing that he had organized. It was testimony from citizens about the civil rights violations that were occurring in Mississippi at the time. Again, this was 1964. We have, of course, a couple of editions of his novels, One Another Country, and then The Fire the Next Time. We have images of him at the 1965 Selma to Montgomery March to document his civil rights activity. 1964 playbill, Blues for Mr. Charlie. So he was not only an essayist, a poet, a playwright, journalist. He wrote across genre. So we wanted people to know about the Amen Corner and about Blues for Mr. Charlie, two of his most popular plays. We have a postcard that he sent to his sister from Istanbul. I mentioned that decade that he spent in Turkey. We also have a badge, a 1968 World Council of Churches badge, which is an interesting story behind that. This event was held in Sweden, and Martin Luther King Jr. was scheduled to speak, but he was assassinated, as we know, in 1968. And so James Baldwin was called upon to speak in his absence. And so he spoke about the atrocities of apartheid in South Africa at that time. Now, some other items in the collection that are not on display, things like canceled checks to SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which shows that he not only supported the movement physically, intellectually, but also financially. Checks showing payments to him for works that he contributed to Nougat magazine, things of that nature. Personal correspondences to and from his family members, showing the ties of affection and support that they had for one another. He came from a very large family. He was the oldest of like 9 children, and they remained in close contact throughout the years that he was living abroad.
Yes, many of those family letters were transcribed by our volunteers a few years ago. So there were 2, for those of you who have been volunteering with us for a little while, you might remember that a few years ago, we launched another set of James Baldwin materials that was primarily letters and a lot of material from his time living in Turkey, just as Tulani said. And then this next set that we just transcribed for Black History Month 2021 was just sort of a later set of materials, including some of this other content that Tulani mentioned that was just donated at a later time to the museum. But they all sort of represent this really interesting picture of James Baldwin's personal life and professional life in a way that we don't always get to see or know about. I didn't know about the canceled checks. That's really fascinating, like glimpse into history and his life and those kind of minute details about somebody.
Yeah, absolutely. And I have to mention the materials that show his connection to other writers, such as to Maya Angelou and to Alex Haley, correspondences between them. And then some news clippings. There's a news clipping with him. I think we have that with Lucien Happesberger, who played an instrumental role in helping Baldwin to get his first novel published, Go Tell It on the Mountain. When he arrived in Paris in 1948, at the age of 24, he met Lucien, who was Swiss, and he allowed Baldwin to complete his novel in his Swiss villa up in the mountains. And so he completed Go Tell It on the Mountain.
That's lovely.
Up in the mountains.
That is lovely.
Yeah. Oh, and of course, one final item, a letter from Dr. Martin Luther King to James Baldwin, commending him on his publication of Nobody Knows My Name in 1961. And he mentions to Baldwin how Baldwin has given him greater insight into the meaning of the African American struggle. So that's quite a commendation coming from King to Baldwin.
Yeah, this is a letter we just, Emily just shared it on the screen with us, and we'll post and she posted in the chat, she already beat me to it, the direct link to that letter in Transcription Center. So this is one of the ones that we transcribed last month. And it's really amazing and powerful because exactly as Tulani said, it's Dr. King commending Baldwin on his work and sharing with him the power of Baldwin's work to him personally, which is really incredible to read. He says that Baldwin makes them all proud to be Black Americans, which is really amazing. It's really beautiful. And I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Tulani, because you would obviously know better than me, but some of the collections team at the museum noted that this is one of only a few letters in the collection from Dr. King that has his personal signature on it.
Yes, that is correct.
Yeah, that's really amazing. I think we have as well, I don't know if Emily, if you want to sort of go to the next image on the slide deck here, but I think we also have James Baldwin's diploma, his DeWitt High School diploma, is that right? Yeah. And an award certificate from him. So again, these sort of glimpses into his personal life that we don't always get from just reading his amazing published works.
Yes, and this is very critical because this object tells us how Baldwin really got his start as a writer. He became the editor of the Magpie, which was the literary magazine at DeWitt Clinton High School. And so he started writing and publishing things as early, as his, I think that the graduation date on there, can we see that?
I don't know if we can see the graduation date. 1942.
Yes.
Is
42.
from, yeah, is that certificate issued to him. That's lovely.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I mean, James Baldwin is obviously a big name that many people are familiar with, many, not only was he just so accomplished and, as you said, sort of skilled in various different types of writing, not just his sort of noteworthy novels. But, what can we kind of, from all of these collections that we have, you mentioned these canceled checks, these personal letters with his family, this sort of glimpse into his high school career. What else do you think we can kind of learn about him that might be new or relevant for the current day by looking at these archival collections that we have from Baldwin?
Well, like all literature, it gives us insight into people's way of thinking
Mhm.
and their way of being in the world. And I think artists, more so than anybody else, they question, the conventional. They're not content to live their lives by the strictures that are set forth in society that one must follow. So it gives us insight into their way of thinking and their way of being in the world, and it inspires people to think more broadly about their own lives. Um, it inspires people to look to explore ideas in a different way, ideas related to race, sexuality, religion, gender, and so forth. So, it's studying literature is a way of just becoming more enlightened and hopefully a way of helping us to work toward a more just society and a more just world.
Do you think that James Baldwin himself, I know that he wrote quite a bit and shared quite a bit about what sort of meant something to him in his own life and what inspired him and what kind of influenced him and the growth of his writing. But, were other previous African American authors and writers, did they kind of contribute to James Baldwin's work? I'm thinking here a little bit of some of the 19th century and early 20th century authors that we have shared collections of in the Transcription Center, like Paul Laurence Dunbar or Charles Chestnut and others, that sort of came before Baldwin. Do you think that they influenced his work at all, or do we know if they did specifically?
Yeah, I think, in general, each generation builds upon, the preceding. The works by such greats as Paul Laurence Dunbar and Phyllis Wheatley and a lot of the other writers, even the writers of slave narratives, these works are foundational. And that simply means they do provide a foundation upon which other writers can build their works. So there are influences. You can see connections when you think about Paul Laurence Dunbar and James Baldwin, how they got involved in writing. There are parallels there. Paul Laurence Dunbar, like Baldwin, graduated from a very good high school. Dunbar graduated from Central in Dayton, Ohio.
Okay.
And but also like Baldwin, he didn't have enough money to go on to college. But at Central, he too became the editor of the literary magazine there, so who knows, perhaps that's a fact that Baldwin was aware of himself when he decided to become the editor of the literary magazine at DeWitt Clinton. And yeah. So I say that yes, there are influences always. And when we delve more deeply into Dunbar, for example, we can see Dunbar's influence on Maya Angelou.
Oh, okay.
So whenever you're ready to talk about
Yeah, let's get
Dunbar,
into Dunbar.
I
Yeah,
can
so
share that.
last month we transcribed a number of different published works from Dunbar.
Yeah.
So of course the museum's collections hold these sort of personal archival collections, like what we just talked about with James Baldwin. But then you will also hold different editions of published works. And even though we know that these are publications that have been around for decades, sometimes centuries, and can be found other places, sometimes they're particular editions, first editions, rare editions that the museum collects and wants as part of their collections. And then also transcribing them adds another layer of awareness and accessibility and searchability within our collections. So opening up and sharing those works and those stories even further. So we transcribed the lyrics of Love and Laughter from Paul Laurence Dunbar, and When Melindy Sings, and poems of Cabin and Field. So yeah, can you tell us a little bit about Dunbar and his background and his influence on African American writing and poetry?
Yeah, so he was an early poet. In fact, he was nationally and internationally recognized, and I would say he was the first African American to be recognized in that way as both a poet and a novelist. We know that Phyllis Wheatley had the distinction of being internationally recognized as well as a poet. But he also wrote novels. He became particularly well known for his dialect poetry, even though he wrote equally as much in standard written English. But the dialect poetry became pretty popular. And that poetry, we were talking about influences before, that poetry influenced writers of Harlem Renaissance as well as the Black arts movement in particular to begin to write in a language that was more authentic to their own experiences. Dunbar wrote about the plantation life. He had heard stories from his mother, who had been enslaved, about what plantation life was all about. So we see that, reflected in lyrics of Love and Laughter, which is a combination of dialect poetry and standard English poetry, and Cabin and Field, which is primarily all dialect.
Okay. Yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, what do you think, Dunbar's poetry has been around for some time, and as you said, he's been kind of heralded as this one of the first or the first African American novelist and poet. What do you think his writing can kind of still tell us today? How is it still relevant in the 21st century? Because he wrote these poems at the beginning of the 20th century, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yes, and part of 19th century as well. Mm-hmm. But his poetry is still powerful in the 21st century because even with the dialect poetry, his themes are universal. Themes of love, for example, in the popularized poem, A Negro Love Song, and also in the poem, We Wear the Mask, in which he underscores the theme of masking. And masking is a universal practice. It's something that all human beings do. It's a way of covering up or hiding the pain that we feel deeply inside. So we may smile when we really feel like crying. We may laugh, when we are really enduring internal conflict. And so that's what We Wear the Mask is all about. And I will say that the poet Maya Angelou in the 20th, 21st century helped to popularize these two poems through her very dynamic recitations She recited the Negro love song, Jump Back, Honey, Jump Back, if you've heard that.
Mhm.
And then we wear the mask that grins and lies, hides our cheeks and shades our eyes. This debt we pay to human guile. With torn and bleeding hearts, we smile. And so, again, that's a theme that is applicable to any human being of any race, culture, religion. And so, yes, very universal.
And very
And of
powerful.
course, throughout every period of history, African Americans have had to wear the mask as a survival technique. And that's what masking is all about. It's about survival and progress.
Mhm.
And whether you're in the field, in the big house, or in the corporate boardroom, sometimes we're not able to say what we really want to say, or to express what we really feel. So we wear the mask in order to survive.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's really interesting that you say, these are themes that are sort of running through all of history and all of society. And I think, I mean, obviously that's true for all of these authors' works. In Charles Chestnut's The Conjure Woman, he talks about sort of using stereotypes and flipping them on their head to kind of gain strategy and ground and power and authority for yourself. And we definitely, of course, see themes within Baldwin's work that apply to all of our own understandings of identity and love and sexuality and life in general, that sort of run through those. So I think it's really powerful. And by engaging with these things on a very kind of magnified and minute level through transcription, we're opening them up even further by allowing more and more people to know about them, to read through them more closely, to be able to search for these things and come upon these collections that maybe we have known about before, but we haven't necessarily connected to different things in different ways. And so we're amplifying the ability to sort of learn from these again in a new way with new audiences. And I think that that's really exciting. That's what makes transcription, I think, so exciting, and bringing these collections to the forefront in different ways. So before we sort of dive into audience questions, I wanted to also ask, you've been doing this for a long time and helping the museum acquire these collections. Do you have a particular author or a particular collection or set of materials that means the most to you, or is your favorite? If you can pick a favorite.
No, I can't say I really have a favorite. I will say, of course, Baldwin in contemporary times. I will say that Maya Angelou, because Maya Angelou's book, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, which is, in fact, a title that was taken from a poem by Laurence Dunbar called Sympathy. A line in that poem is, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. But her memoir, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, was the first book that I read, I would say, from cover to cover. It was the first memoir I had read when I was 13 years old.
Wow.
And I remember, it had such vivid imagery in it that I remember it even to this day. So I kind of followed her career throughout the years. So Maya Angelou and James Baldwin, and
Yeah.
they were dear friends.
Oh, okay. Yeah, these
Yes.
connections between these
Yes.
authors, not only influencing each other, but actually knowing each other. That's pretty incredible. To sort of see all of these big names together, when you're talking about Baldwin in during the civil rights movement and in Selma and Mississippi, that's another sort of connection that we have as well, in that the African American History and Culture Museum has all of these amazing collections from Baldwin. And our American History Museum here at the Smithsonian in the Archives Center holds a number of audio recordings created by Moses Moon during the Freedom Summer of various events and speeches and rallies during the Civil Rights Movement. And in a few of those, James Baldwin speaks at some of these different events. So it's really amazing to sort of see all of those connections. So we have a question from Marcus. Is Dunbar's dialect approach in any way similar to the style of Zora Neale Hurston's?
Both of these writers were very authentic writers. They came from different time periods, so they were different. Again, as I had mentioned previously, Dunbar's dialect poetry was drawn from the plantation where his mother had been enslaved, and Zora Neale Hurston, during her travels throughout the South as an anthropologist, much later into the 20th century. So language changes over time, and that includes dialects as well.
That's really interesting. In terms of, sort of the history of African American authors and African literature and writing, we also transcribed a number of audio recordings from this Wisconsin Public Radio University of Wisconsin program in the 1970s by an undergraduate student, Brooks Robinson, who put together this incredible radio series sort of covering the history of African and African American literature. And he interviewed different poets and authors and professors in his own department about this history. And obviously he talked a lot about Baldwin and about Laurence Dunbar and Maya Angelou, and Phyllis Wheatley. There's one that sort of talks about this history from the 17th century onward, and the sort of power that all of these different types of individuals and their experiences brought to the genre. What do you think, have you listened to those recordings? And, what are your sort of thoughts on, this is in the 1970s,
Yes.
But yet I found them to be very exciting to sort of hear at this time of immense change in American history, how this undergraduate student was approaching these topics. How do you think we can kind of learn from that today and sort of listen to those recordings and learn new things about how students and educators were interpreting these authors in the 70s? Do you think that's changed at all, or do you think we can learn something new there?
Yes, absolutely. So these were accessioned into our collection in 2010. In fact, that was the same year I started working with the museum. And we collected them because we use audiovisual recordings as interpretive elements in our exhibitions. But these will primarily serve as a part of our research and literary studies collection. They examine a part of the African American literary canon through, as you mentioned, through the 1970s, and with such titles as Introduction to African American Literature. And they even examine African literature written in English and offer comparative analysis of African literature and African American literature. They examine such prominent writers as Wale Soyinka and Chinua Achebe of Nigeria. And so yes, I think the themes that were pervasive at that time, were underscored, and the tapes pretty much just allow researchers to find, evaluate, and synthesize information from that period, from the tapes as both primary sources, because we're actually hearing the original literature and as well as secondary sources, because we hear scholars talking about the literature. So yes, these are excellent for anyone who's doing research in literary history, the literary history of African Americans.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting to sort of see that parallel, to sort of see these materials from Dunbar and Baldwin and Chestnut and Solomon Northup, and then hear them being talked about in these interviews on the Literary Corner, you know, a century later or a few decades later. I think that was really interesting. So Marcus also asked, how did the museum acquire some of the Dunbar materials, and what's the process for the museum to gain possession of these wonderful items? Yeah, I think that's a great question.
Yes,
in general,
we acquire most of our materials through donations, but we also, as we did with Dunbar materials, we purchase items from collectors and from auction houses as well. So those were purchases.
And you know, I know that some of those Dunbar publications are very like specific editions, as was the Solomon Northup's 12 Years a Slave edition that we transcribed. Can you tell us a little bit about, you know, why certain editions? You know, I have an archives background. I don't have a rare book or special collections background. You know, so what makes some of these specific published sources kind of valuable or interesting to the museum to want to bring into your collections, in terms of, you know, what makes this Dunbar edition something that you'd want versus a different edition of When Melindy Sings or a different edition of Poems?
Yes, we generally try to collect first editions before they have undergone any kind of abridgment or changes. But just as the writer had initially created it. And a lot of times the very first edition might include certain valuable illustrations. They may also include signatures, inscriptions that show maybe the writer's relationship to another writer or to another artist or to a family member, or to someone in a totally different discipline. So the inscriptions make it even that more valuable.
Fabulous. Are these, you know, I know some of these collections, as you said, are on exhibit and some of them aren't. Are any of these materials, some of these editions of Dunbar's books, some of the Baldwin collection, the Baldwin archive, are any of these available for researchers to come and see when the museum is open?
When the museum is, yes, when the museum opens back up, you know, there is a process that researchers can do to apply to come out to our facility in Landover, Maryland, Pennsy, where we store all of our collections. And, you know, they can examine these works firsthand. You can also do a collection search on our website, because a great portion of our collections have been digitized. So you can get images and information directly from the website. It's just a matter of going to the website and clicking on search the collection.
Awesome. And that's a great point too, that, you know, many of these materials have been digitized and are available to be kind of looked through and explored at your own leisure from the safety of your own home when the museum is closed. But by transcribing them, which of course we've transcribed all of the ones that we've talked about today, but then many other hundreds of collections, thousands of pages from the African American History Museum's collections and archives, that adds another layer of accessibility and searchability to them. So not only are you able to find those materials and explore them online, but you have this beautiful transcript that you can keyword search, and that can show you, you know, if you were to search for Martin Luther King Jr. now in our collection search page, you would find all of the materials from the African American History Museum related to King, but you would also come upon this exact letter in Transcription Center that King wrote to Baldwin. So that's really exciting that we have this. Our volunteers are actively helping us to unlock these collections even further. Okay, another question here. This is great. What collections are offered on Black education post-emancipation? And can I find that in the digital collections too? Awesome. Yes. Yeah, absolutely. So I'll let Tulani answer this, and then we can definitely share links with you as well in the chat.
Your voice is waning just a little. Can you repeat what his question was?
Yeah, what collections are offered on Black educators post-emancipation?
Oh, educators. Mm-hmm. We have yeah, there's from a literary standpoint, the first thing item that comes to mind is Elaine Locke's The New Negro. He was a scholar, educator, and considered to be a kind of architect of the New Negro movement, or the Harlem Renaissance as we know it. We have information on the historian. Oh, wow. John Franklin, okay. Who was really an activist, historian, and educator. Mm-hmm. We have, there are lots of educators in the field of history as well as the field of literature. But I'd have to reflect a little bit to rattle off any more names.
We can definitely add some stuff to.
But there are hosts, and I have to, mention women. Mm-hmm. My goodness, Mary McLeod Bethune, mm-hmm. Major educator. Yeah, so.
Yeah, and we can include in the chat some links as well. And you're always, of course, welcome to reach out to us via email, and we can send you more information on how to sort of search our collections across mm-hmm. the Smithsonian and in the African American History Museum and in the Transcription Center. So exactly as Tulani noted, many of these particular individuals are in the Transcription Center, and many of their works are as well. We have a few things on Mary McLeod Bethune. And Library of Congress, our partners, our federal cousins, in their crowdsourcing project actually just did a very big crowdsourcing project with her collections, transcription project, which is amazing. And then we've also, this month, we launched a number of diaries from the African American History Museum's collections from two female doctors, physicians, who were also medical educators as well. So I know that's like a little bit different. That's kind of a sideline. But these two women, Dr. Ionia Whipper and Dr. Matilda Evans, were two of the first African-American female physicians in the United States, and they taught many other doctors, nurses, and midwives in their fields, which is really exciting. And their journals are absolutely beautiful. So the short answer is yes, we have a lot of information on African American educators post-emancipation and the Black experience post-emancipation as well. So we'll definitely share more content. And yes, please feel free to email us. So in terms of, kind of other collections, I know that we wanted to focus mostly in this discussion about what we've transcribed, obviously, but are there any other sorts of materials related to language and literature in the collections that you find really interesting, or there's going to be some sort of online exhibition or more information about soon, or any kind of sneak peeks of new collections that you can tell us about? If you're allowed to share that. I don't know if you're allowed to share any information.
No, not at this time, but I wanted to say a word about the slave narratives because of the place that they hold in African American literary history. They were, after the oral tradition, really the first form of literature for African American people. And so in our Slavery and Freedom Gallery, okay, my image, I got a call came in. So in the Slavery and Freedom Gallery, we have slave narratives of Frederick Douglass, and you mentioned Solomon Northup. Some people are familiar with Solomon Northup's story because of the film adaptation, 12 Years a Slave, that came out in 2013. But that's a very compelling story that we wanted to share with our visitors because it shows a little bit about the diversity of slavery practices in different states. It was not a uniform practice. Treatment of slaves were different. Treatment of free people were different. But Solomon Northup, he had been born in 1808. He died around 1863. That's a big question mark beside that. Some scholars say that it was later. But he was an abolitionist. He was a landowner in New York. And he played the violin, and on a trip to Washington, D.C., for a gig, he was drugged, and he was captured, and he was sent to a plantation in New Orleans. So he was enslaved in New Orleans for 12 years around I'm sorry, not in New Orleans, but the Red River region of Louisiana. But initially he was taken to New Orleans. And so we wanted to give insight into his life as a free person, as an abolitionist, as an accomplished musician, but also into, the vicious, fairly commonplace practice of enslaving free people, free African Americans.
Yes.
Who had never experienced enslavement at all, and tell the story of how he was captured and then how he ultimately regained his freedom through aid from New York, his home state.
And his memoir that he wrote, obviously, after getting back to New York and escaping enslavement, was really an act of activism and defiance in itself, in sharing his story and bringing light to these atrocities and this viciousness. And it was, gained a lot of power in the abolitionist movement, correct?
Yes, it did. He was a very, very much a part of the abolitionist movement. Prior to being captured, he used to give speeches. He was quite articulate. He used to give speeches. So this memoir simply added to that effort to reveal the nature and the atrocity of slavery.
Can you, in terms of, and correct me if I'm wrong, I'm remembering this from my own little explorations of some of these projects that we did. But Solomon's memoir was kind of rediscovered in the 20th century, correct? It was used a lot in the abolitionist movement during his lifetime and after. But then it was kind of like almost lost in a sense, and it was rediscovered by some historians, correct?
Yes, that is my understanding. I don't have a lot of detail on that, but that is my understanding as well.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah, I mean, and this idea of, obviously his is sort of a different kind of format than some of the other kinds of slave narratives that we see and that you all have in your collections that we have transcribed as part of Transcription Center's work on the African American history collections. But I think it's a great example of not only the breadth of your content, but the depth of information about the African American experience and about American history that we can learn from these collections, and we can unlock even further through transcription. As you're talking about the Slavery and Freedom exhibit at the African American History Museum, I think one of the things that for those of us who have been there is so powerful about that exhibit is sort of all of these individual small items and materials that show this personal story of this horrible history. And in the Transcription Center, we're helping to bring light to that and kind of share these people's experiences and identify them and share their stories even further. So from the collections of the African American History Museum, we've also transcribed a number of registers from ships carrying enslaved individuals that actually name a lot of these individuals. And, by transcribing those records, we're helping to make sure that those names are not lost to history, that they can be found, that people can research and locate their ancestors, and sort of unlock those collections in a way that we haven't been able to even further. And we're certainly doing that with the Freedmen's Bureau records, which of course are an incredible collection that we're working on in collaboration with the National Archives to transcribe more than 1.7 million pages of Freedmen's Bureau records. So it all makes a huge amount of difference to the work of our staff across the institution. I'm curious to know, you've been involved in the transcription project, Tulani, for quite some time now, helping us with the James Baldwin collection a few years ago, and then of course helping us with these materials now. Has transcription of any of these materials helped in your research or in sharing any of the work of these authors or individuals that are represented in the collections?
Well, I can't say that I have, however, only because we are just doing so much, all of us researching in different areas. But no, I do talk about the Transcription Center quite a bit to friends, to colleagues, and I encourage them to visit. And they're always fascinated, that they can have this kind of accessibility and searchability in documents that would otherwise content that would pretty much remain buried.
Yes.
So yes, I'm a true supporter of the Transcription Center and encouraging researchers to take advantage of this tremendous resource.
Absolutely. And I know that someone asked about more information about transcribing and becoming one of our volunteers. Absolutely. So we'll post the link to our website in the chat. But anybody over the age of 14 can register for an account, and that just requires an email and a username of your choosing. There's no other kind of formal application process or anything. So anybody can sign up. And then anyone at any age can transcribe anonymously or explore our website. So, and then of course you can always reach out to myself and Emily with questions as you're transcribing. Someone also asked, what are some practical ways to acclimate students and even family into researching history? Ooh, that's a great question. I think from our perspective in the Transcription Center, obviously transcription is a great way to acclimate students and family members to history, because I think that there's something, and I understand that I am, this is my job, but I feel this in my bones. I think there's something really powerful about exploring history through the words of those who lived it, and especially in a kind of intimate and personal way, as you sitting at your computer looking and being able to zoom in on and read word by word the diary of somebody, a doctor like Ionia Whipper, or these personal letters of somebody like James Baldwin, and the fact that you're not only able to read those and explore them in this really intimate way, but you're able to actually work with us directly to enhance that material and preserve that person's personal story through transcription. We do have documents of all different kinds of difficulty levels, so don't get intimidated if there's kind of difficult cursive to read. We also have typed stuff, and materials related to all kinds of different time periods in history and topics. So I highly recommend starting there. But then I also think it's really great to sort of search through historical collections for your own connection to the past. Not only are a lot of these topics and kinds of information very applicable and relevant, exactly like Tulani was saying, you know, yes, this may be a poem written at the end of the 19th century, but Laurence Dunbar is writing about love and, you know, navigating the world in and all of the emotions and difficulties that come with that as a person, as an African American, as a man. And I think, you know, that relates to everybody. So recognizing your own story and the stories of others, I think, is really important in a way to sort of acclimate yourself to history, but then also literally finding yourself in historical records. So you can search across the Transcription Center for your family name and locate ancestors, possibly who may be included in our records, like the Freedmen's Bureau. Our own Smithsonian Secretary Lonnie Bunch, has located his own ancestors in the North Carolina Freedmen's Bureau records, and many of our volunteers have found information on their ancestors. Tulani, do you have any tips for how to acclimate people to history?
I would be totally remiss if I didn't mention oral history interviews. We have an oral history program at our museum, and our oral historian periodically gives workshops on how to do a family oral history. So, you know, think about aging members of your family and consider sitting down and interviewing them, you know, about their life or some aspect of their life that you can record and share with other family members.
Absolutely. That's a great tip. And in addition to that, the Robert Smith Family History Center at the African American History and Culture Museum, which of course is not open, but the website is available. We'll include that in the chat as well. And they have many amazing staff on hand, including a lot of genealogists who are extremely skilled, and a lot of really amazing resources available to help you kind of start tracking your own genealogy if you're interested in that. And then also exploring some of these kind of home movie collections and oral history collections like Tulani's talking about at the African American History Museum, and how to kind of get started yourself making your own collection. So I can't recommend the Family History Center enough. It's pretty wonderful. Well, I think that's about all the time we have for today. But I know that this has been extremely educational for me. I did not know very much about Dunbar before seeing his works in Transcription Center, and learning about them with you today has been really, really wonderful and enlightening. And his connection to Maya Angelou is absolutely fascinating. So thank you for sharing this with us today, and for, you know, taking time to answer questions. And of course, anyone can continue to reach out to us at any time through our email. So thank you, Tulani.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to be here with you, with everyone today.
And thank you all for joining us. Please feel free to follow along with us on social media and on the Transcription Center. We have a lot of awesome new projects coming in April and May. Our website and our social media handles are up on the screen right now. We'll leave those for just a minute. Otherwise, everybody have a fantastic week. We will do this again next month. We will be featuring a collections deep dive with the National Air and Space Museum staff. So stay tuned for more information from there. All right, everybody, thank you. Have a great afternoon.